Dr. Chohan, now what is going to be the biggest challenge on the economic front as far as whenever the new government comes in?
In my judgment, the single most scary thing out there is inflation. It is still a very high number, and it is at a base rate that is monstrous. So if you go from 38% in one jump and then you go from 25%, you're going 25% higher from the previous 38%. So what you have now is a cost of living crisis. And the best way to deal with that is to look at what is it that we don't produce that we need to produce. There are limitations in that. For example, we are an energy importing country. But there are plenty of things that can be indigenized at a high quality and need to be done so. And as far as the energy aspect goes, I also see a long-term secular trend that is not going to be a bad thing in the long run, which is that you have these oil exporting countries, hydrocarbon countries, that are trying to milk their hydrocarbons for as much as possible before the world goes green. Basically, that I think is a very serious thing where countries are trying to squeeze as much out and keep the price as high for as long as possible before we simply move on to electric vehicles and other things. So insofar as we don't import energy, we have to at least look at the circular debt element so that it doesn't compound over time, settle this once and for all, and look at the design of our society and make sure that there are practical measures taken so that our energy reliance is more towards renewables or towards sustainable things rather than continuing in the business as usual manner with a swelling middle class continuing the same asymmetric, unsustainable consumption pattern.
So what's required in order to deal with circular debt? I mean, the number of its entire system, the transmission, the distribution, the line losses, and then there's been a crackdown in the recent past by the authorities as far as power pilferage is concerned.
The simplest way to put it is that I believe every country comes across one issue that everyone else has resolved, but that particular country somehow cannot. In the United States, it's healthcare. Everybody else has solved healthcare, but America cannot offer that. And the equivalent is that in Pakistan, everyone else has an energy plan that works, but we have somehow made it such a big monster that it cannot be tackled easily. You have correctly pointed out to the energy and the generation, transmission, and distribution and consumption elements. They all are important. But what you have now is that the way it's designed, at what price it's procured, at the guaranteed rates that it's given, with an old infrastructure that has line losses, you're basically seeing across the chain problems. But this caretaker government has put in very serious thought regarding having this settled once and for all. And what they have done in that is look at how the contracts are set up, what is the nature of energy distribution, how can this all be settled, what needs to be passed on to the state-owned enterprises like OGDC, what needs to be taken on as public debt, etc. It's all very well structured, and perhaps if the caretaker government had more time, they would be the ones doing it. But if somebody else is coming in their place, they should have the continue on this path.
Right. I'll come back to you to take your understanding of when you talk of the cost of living crisis, and we are unable to produce those things which we are utilizing. Hence, we have to depend on imports naturally. So, where to start that indigenization process in that particular regard? Dr. Rahman, what's your understanding? As soon as the new government takes power, what's going to be the immediate economic challenge it is going to be faced with, and how should it be dealt?
Obviously, the first challenge will be inflation, and that inflation is linked with the energy prices mainly. So the first thing that comes in our mind as a government is that the prices will go up, and there is obvious reason for that. There are mainly the international reason, the Russia-Ukraine war, and the instability in the global world is increasing day by day. So especially in the Middle East, that will highly impact the energy prices. That will be translated into mainly in the electricity prices, because mainly we are generating electricity through thermal. The other thing that I feel is we really need to understand where the inflation is coming from. Like, if we look at our basket, the mainly it is coming either from the food items or from the energy. So the CPI basket mainly contain the 80% of the food items. Like we Pakistani spend their mostly income on the food. Then again there comes an important factor, of the disasters that comes, that also basically mismatch the demand and supply. Vegetables, rice, each and everything, that also contribute. And now if we are moving further to the IMF, and then in April we are going to
we'll go to that particular point of the likelihood of that particular new program, the IMF. When you talk about 80% of the needs from food items when it comes to the cost of living overall generally, so I mean, how to address that? You know, where are we getting those food items from? Are 80% entirely being imported? Is that increasing the cost in that sense?
Yeah, we are importing very basic stuff that we can produce, like tomatoes, we are importing from India, like the onions we are importing from Afghanistan, and then we further see like wheat, very basic items. So again, something that is happening with the wheat is, when we have abundance of wheat, then there are some technical problem with the storage of wheat. A lot of wheat is wasted. Again, when the food is wasting.
So what's required to enhance the and make the storage capacity more efficient? So there are new scientific techniques?
Yeah, there are, but
what's required to bring in those?
The first thing that is happening here in Pakistan, government basically purchase the wheat and then they store it. The first thing is, and then there is no proper mechanism to save them from the rain. Like they are using very traditional stuff rather than having very state-of-the-art technologies that can save the wheat. So nearly, this is one of the studies that I have gone through, is that around 30 to 35% of the wheat that has been stored are basically wasted.
So let me take this particular point of the wastage of the food items, particularly when you give the example of wheat. Dr. Chohan, what's your understanding of that? What about increasing the capacity in terms of the storage of essential food items?
I fully agree with my dear colleague that it's the supply chain that doesn't make sense. Let's take the wheat example. Pakistan produces as much wheat as Ukraine did in its peacetime, pre-war level, about 25 million tons, which is an enormous amount because Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of Europe. So you, as one country in this region, produced about the same or even more in some years than the breadbasket of Europe. That's a very impressive thing to do. But the fact is that so much spoilage happens. The supply chain is so badly designed, and there's too much regulation, and there's so much distortion because of pricing created, that incentives go haywire across a supply chain, so that by the time it comes to market, there's actually not enough, it's too expensive, and what was given to the original producer, the farmer, is not enough for him. So the distortions are haywire across the system. And this other thing that was previously a taboo, but I think that many people are coming around to realizing it, is that 25 million tons is reasonable if you have a population of a decent size. And our population is now of an indecent size. It's just too fast in its growth, and you cannot feed, even if you are, after the Green Revolution of the 60s, a breadbasket in your own right. If your population has grown eightfold since then, in 2 generations grown eightfold, it's simply not enough. And so you have to then think about converting your barren areas and your irrigation networks to expand to the entirety of the country. That is a technological process, and it requires investment with a long-term mindset to make all of Pakistan productive in the same way that certain regions are.
So for that calls for the population control at the same time also.
It does.
By looking into different other aspects of ensuring food security.
Absolutely.
So what's required for going ahead with that particular population control program? What could be the ideal contours of that, where there could be some sensitivity also associated with the very concept of population control, but that's what is exactly required at this particular point in time in order to manage the resources in a befitting manner?
I think that there's many good case studies for this, and 2 that resemble us in terms of culture and level of economic development are Iran and Bangladesh, which are very similar. So what is a strength in Iran, for example, was that they took their clergy and their conservative elements and galvanized them first after their Iran-Iraq war to produce a significant increase in the population, and then use the same vehicle to then encourage a reduction in it. We have a clergy and a large community that is involved in various ways with religiosity, let's say. And so to motivate them towards the family planning element is absolutely necessary, and it was done in Iran. The other one is Bangladesh, where even though the per capita income may be unequally distributed poverty, not particularly high, but they add this grassroots emanation of it. And women empowerment was a very significant factor in that, because women in Bangladesh are very, very much employed either in agrarian or in their factories, and so having that income of their own plus microfinance and other vehicles gave them that decision-making power. That decision-making power does not exist with a young mother today in Pakistan. So her in-laws are making the choices, her husband is making the choice, and she's financially too disempowered to make the counter argument, because typically in organisms as complex as humans, the preference is from the maternal side for quality of children and from the paternal side on quantity of children. That imbalance is too large in Pakistan. That's more of a scientific and biological approach to it.
There's one other aspect to this one. I'll come back to you. Dr. Rahman, what's your understanding? What could be, do you think there could be a national policy in terms of controlling the population in order to better the resources, manage the resources in a better way?
Yeah, this is the controlling the population is very sensitive issue in Pakistan, because it's a lot of threat, including political, economic, and most of the cases the religious one. So we have some religious belief about the having a newborn baby that come with his own bread and all this stuff. But when it comes to the controlling the population, the main thing is to educate your girls. When the girls are married in the teenage, at this stage, they don't get into the labor market because they don't have enough education to get into labor market. Like, for instance, you are 16 years, 17 years, 18 years, and you get married. You have no education, no skill. You can't participate in the labor market. Then
neither in the decision-making process, as Dr. Chohan had mentioned.
Yeah. So what left? Their children and the husband, or like reproducing more and more child. Rather, if your wife is in the labor market, you think twice or thrice before having a new baby, because a lot is involved in it. She's going to work. So the main component is to educate your
and empowering
daughters.
women.
Yeah.
Right. So, Dr. Chohan, what about incentivizing families? The smaller the family you have, you would be incentivized more by the authorities. Could a plan of that sort be also thought about and implemented?
In principle, it is often recommended, but the data that we have gathered, both in terms of incentivizing the increase in family size as well as decreasing, is that government policy on family planning tends not to work because it's a private decision. So China, for example, had the one-child policy, and it really focused on the quality, and now you have a huge high-quality population, but now they're trying to re-incentivize the growth of the family through financial or monetary incentives, giving them apartments, etc., but it's not working.
So, but when you talk of this particular thing, this phenomenon is a private decision-making process, right? But it has the ramifications at the national level.
It does.
So, of course, there has to be some sort of a policy well thought out, keeping all those sensitivities in view. And perhaps when I talk of incentivizing, of having a smaller family, it perhaps is not in the ambit of coercion. So, incentives to a smaller family, don't you think that's going to attract people rather than they are going to consider that they are being pressurized by the authorities?
I wouldn't, yes, you're right, but I wouldn't frame it in terms of a overarching policy per se, but rather to have the specific policy being more targeted towards the empowerment of the woman, which is to say the education, as my dear colleague correctly mentioned, but also the financial empowerment, because you can be illiterate but still financially empowered. You, for example, have very low female independent bank accounts, which is to say the banking sector doesn't deal with them. And as our colleague previously said, the banks are basically lending to the government. They're not even interested in you and me, whether we're men or women. So the banking sector empowering the women to save, and then having a wage thing. Yes, the skills part is important, but there's also very rudimentary jobs where they are held back from it. Mobile phone access is also often mediated through the husband. These sorts of things mean that they're kept in a sort of limited condition where they wouldn't be able to make the sorts of long-term planning, and that's what I would, yes, accepting your point about policy, but it wouldn't be an overall targeting thing, but it would be these other policies that triangulate towards that.
Right. Dr. Rahman, your understanding of how, if this concept, if you understand of it, if it is implementable, this incentivizing smaller families as compared to the people who are having bigger ones?
Yeah. Actually, what is happening now, the families are getting more and more educated now. The couples are basically, both of them are working in most of the cases in the urban areas, like if we see in Islamabad, Karachi. So this is already changing, and if we see our fertility number, these are declining very rapidly as compared to last 20 years, 30 years. So obviously it is impacting through education, and again the economic situation where one bread earner is now not enough, keeping in view the whole circumstances that we are dealing with, especially the inflation one. So females are somehow contributing either in a formal way or informal way, stitching the clothes or doing embroidery or doing something like that. That ultimately affects the time that is required for the child care. So that's why their decision making is changing over the time. So it ultimately affects the fertility rates, and then it is changing without having any incentive that the government is providing. But again, government is investing a lot on the advertisement, despite the religious factor that is really strong till now in the rural areas in Pakistan. But I think the education and the progression of mind will really cope this thing over the time.
Right, Dr. Chohan, recently we have seen there has been a talk about the restructuring of the Federal Board of Revenue, where it talks about collection of more taxes. We have also seen a little bit of achievement in the recent past also, the FPR collecting taxes more than the target it set earlier. Now, how crucial do you think is this particular restructuring process of the FPR, and what are the likely prospects? What sort of dividends in the longer term it's going to have?
It's a very good question, because if you look at the world's taxation models, they come in very different configurations, and having customs and taxation put together works in some contexts, in others it doesn't. Part of the reason here in Pakistan is, for example, that you do raise a lot of revenue through the customs. So you put that, so your current account deficit is an inverse relationship with your fiscal deficit, because when you have imports coming in, you tax them, so you gain some revenue from that, but at the same time you imported more. So it can be lopsided, and insofar as taxation goes, I'm two things. The first is that I'm more interested in tax breadth rather than in depth. You as a salaried person, the three of us, we are the ones being squeezed, but we are also the ones that often are contributing the most in the most decent way, whereas there are very large sectors of the economy that go virtually untaxed because of impunity, because of lobbying, because of politicization. And so I want the tax breadth to be wider. That's the first part of the equation. But if you look at the larger equation beyond that, it is actually the taxation versus expenditure element. And I think that our government is far too large relative to the public value it creates. It needs to be rationalized. It needs to be more public value driven, which is to say that whatever is resource endowments they have, they create value relative to that. That means that you actually won't need that much money to run a government if it has a reasonable size. It cannot bloat, and this is not just a federal thing. Our provincial governments are monolithic Goliaths that don't make sense anymore, and their accountability for what they are doing doesn't make sense. So the expenditure side, I think, is one that is not touched. It's far easier to impose a tax on you tomorrow and squeeze your already limited budget.
Right, you're talking about the expenditure. It's not only the size of the government, but also the debt servicing burden when it comes to the expenditure. So how to deal with that particular aspect of it?
Debt servicing is a function of mistakes made in the past, and so as the mistakes accumulate, every future government has a greater challenge. So as we've had this election right now, I honestly wouldn't even want to sign up for the job, just because it's already so difficult. And what you're seeing right now in terms of debt servicing are decisions made 20 years ago, when at least half of your population was not even born. And the mistakes that we're making now will affect people circa 2045. And that means that this accumulation of decisions, we never take accountability for the future generations, and yet we are such a young country. It means that the misery of every young, or the despondency of every young generation will be magnified unless remedies are taken now for errors past.
So remedies at this point in time, we all know the fact there have been immense challenges because of the climatic disasters also, and the wrong decisions that you have just mentioned long time ago that were made, how to rectify them and what's required. Is it the wider political consensus required at this particular point in time to go ahead and try to rectify those decisions?
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. If you had asked me without even the suggestion that we need to be united, I would have said we need to be united, because that is precisely the answer. I believe that to a large extent the people are united, and I believe that all stakeholders in our society need to listen to the people carefully in what they want, because the answers are written on the wall. It is not that we have to invent rocket science, and there are economies that have done much more simple and primitive measures to keep a more sustainable economy for centuries now. And the same is true for us. But having people in the leadership of one mind and on the same page is important, so long as they are listening to the people, because if you're in an ivory tower and you're listening to one another as leaders, doesn't mean that you're reaching to the grassroots. And input from the grassroots, because of the power distance in our society, we often dispel the idea that people at the ground know the reality. But economics is something that is not done necessarily on blackboards and ivory towers. It's something that's done in the vast field, and it's something that's done in the streets.
Right, Dr. Rahman. Now, restructuring of the Federal Board of Revenue. We've seen success on the part of FBR when it came to collection of taxes, much beyond that particular target already set. Now, where do you think this particular restructuring of the Federal Board of Revenue will actually lead in the longer run in terms of generating and collecting and monitoring and establishing a system of ensuring that there is more regular tax collection?
So this is a long journey. If we say the restructuring FBR, it starts from filing a tax return, how easy it is. The first thing, just start from there. How much documentation you need. You really need a consultant to file your tax return? Is it an easy system? That really affects. So start from the.
But why, whenever we talk about increasing the tax collection and making this particular process easy, now when we talk about the thing that makes me curious, there's so many things that we do in the daily routine life that we can't do it by ourselves. So why is it necessary for everybody to go and file his return by himself? And we always talk of simplifying this particular system. Why can't we go to a consultant to have that done?
So this is the main thing. That's why our tax collection is also affected. There is a long lethargic process that we have to go through when we have to return a tax file. So
perhaps because it's the work of an expert. I mean, for example, if I have to get a water tap corrected in my house that was leaking, I can't do it myself. I have to have some expert on that.
now,
Right, to get it corrected, right? So when it comes to this particular thing of numbers,
No.
you know, so why are we required to do it ourselves? Why isn't it so natural that somebody could go to an expert and consult him to do that?
So the first thing
So
is
how could that be solely the reason of lesser tax collection?
this is the starting point that I am discussing. The process which affects. Then the complex tax rate and multiplicity of taxes at different stages. The firms owner, the consumers, they are so confused about how multiple stages they are collecting the taxes. That makes this system more complex. This system should be very simple rather than more complex. Again, when it comes to the multiplicity of the taxes, so we really need who is bearing the burden, either the consumer or the producer, who are in power, basically. So what is happening? More tax burden is shifting on the consumer rather than producing. That's how this. And then again, if you look at the different sector, why agriculture sector is exempted relatively? And again, when you give this sort of incentive, people are just shifting. Who have agricultural land and then who have factories, they are just doing
So when
capital shifting in
talk
this.
about the agriculture sector, when
Yeah.
Taxing agriculture sector is concerned, aren't there difficulties when it comes to calculating the real income that is coming from the agriculture sector?
No, nowadays, if you look at the India, they did the GIS mapping. Even for the rental income, for the housing income that a person is getting from a house, they can counter check. Now you have technology. Nobody can escape from that. Like You have a GIS mapping, and you can just zoom into what is the size of this house. You can really easily see how much rent they can get and what he is paying in form of taxes. Then again, you can calculate the agricultural land that they are cultivating, and
So
you know the prices. So one thing that FBR should do.
Is it only dependent on calculating the actual size of the land, or when we talk about the actual yield that would be?
Yeah, so
coming
again
later on?
GIS do
So
that.
so there are going to be different factors in play in that particular stage also when it comes to climatic changes also, no?
Yeah,
So
this is
what was
another.
the original estimate of a certain piece of land with this much of a size, which was probably going to have this much of a yield, and somewhere in between, near the harvest or before just the harvest, some climatic disaster happens. So how the things are going to be calculated later on?
Yeah, this is one thing. Like if flood comes, we all know
We had been the victim of climate change.
Yeah, we have been.
But they directly affected the
yeah,
crops.
this is one
back
thing.
in summer
But
2020.
if you calculate in terms of calculation, what I'm saying is how to avoid the taxation. Okay? So this is the main thing. So if there is some evasion in the taxation, we can fix it with the help of technology, either from the agriculture.
digitization. when we
Not
talk
only
about this-
digitization, like if you talk about the GIS, GIS doesn't only calculate the area, but with the color, with the vegetation, they can show the yield. So that you can also calculate by the different bands. So India is doing that.
Right.
So this is one thing that we can introduce, and we can get rid of in some sense from the tax evasion. This is my point of view on that.
Dr. Chohan, when it comes to calculating the real income, should it be as per the size of the land or the actual yield that we get at the end?
It should be a function of both. But the big problem with agriculture in terms of taxation, determining it, is the distortions in prices created throughout. So price setting and price taking is done in a way that the actual producer doesn't get much. And then the final consumer, because of spoilage and all these other issues, doesn't make it. So because you have such weird pricing systems and regulation issues, you actually make it harder to do the tax collection part. This is a thing that has been solved by just about any agrarian society, and even the Mughal Empire had their subedars had outstanding measures of oversight over the agricultural fields. So if our ancestors 300 years ago could do it, I'm shocked that we can't do it today.
Okay, so one last question, likelihood of a newer program with the IMF. Given the fact there have been a lot of tougher measures put in by the authorities, are there any higher chances, and how crucial or it is going to be for Pakistan to have a newer and a longer and a bigger program with the IMF?
I certainly have no doubt that we will secure the next round, the next program, just because this caretaker government has done an excellent job adhering to the stipulations, sometimes at the expense of the public, and they made unpopular decisions, but they were not bound to make popular decisions. They were bound to make sure that Pakistan's economy remains stable until an elected government comes, because they've done an excellent job. Many ministries in this caretaker government did an outstanding job. The finance, foreign office, the aviation, etc. Everyone has done such a good job that I think the ground is set both from the incoming government as well as from the IMF for a new program. It is necessary. The world is a weird place right now in terms of understanding where the inflation is heading, currencies are heading, etc. That we do need some life support and the ICU for now.
Dr. Usman Chohan, economist, thank you very much for joining in the studio for tonight's program. We really appreciate that. And Dr. Abid Rahman, Research Fellow at Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Rahman, as well. We really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. In the next one, take good care of yourselves.